Thank you. Well, I'm neither a Machiavellian nor a classicist. Although I have studied and read in both fields at different points in my career, and my presence on this panel might therefore appear to be something of a puzzle. I think the short version is that 3 years ago I was at a conference with John in Frankfurt on the subject of republicanism and the rule of law, where John gave a paper, I think pretty close to a kind of summary analysis of the general argument in the book, and I told him how much I enjoyed the paper, and how much benefit I'd taken from it. So he must have thought that by being on this panel might somehow be a good thing. The other fact I mentioned at the time was that I had taught a couple of years previously at Stanford's program in Florence, where I had small groups of students, and you get a chance to teach things you otherwise don't know when you teach overseas. So I taught a course on Machiavelli and allowed myself a chance to get into some of the scholarly literature. So my formal credentials here may seem a bit problematic. I'll explain how to deal with them in a second. I want to begin by saying that I find Machiavellian Democracy, as I found John's paper in Frankfurt, a really exciting work. I think that's true for several reasons. I mean, the first is he makes a very strong and I think persuasive argument about how to distinguish Machiavelli as a proto-Republican thinker from, really to put him in an entirely separate category from a much broader stream of Republican thinkers. And I think starting with Ricciardini and culminating in my alter ego, James Madison. And so Machiavelli stands as a kind of strong alternative there, and one starts to see, therefore, in his thinking, a kind of coherence that one might otherwise have missed. I think it's also fair to say that this is a wonderful moment in our history, the history of this republic, to read this book, whether or not we'd have summary execution of people from Goldman Sachs or AIG, or take your favorite firm. Anybody who's at all studied the course of American politics over the last 3 or 4 years has looked at the collapse of the regulatory state and the way in which whether the Republicans out of pure slavishness or the Democrats out of pure temerity or whatever, or just are toadied up to capitalist interests. It seems like it'd be a wonderful moment to have some kind of popular inquisitorial way of getting at the existing structure of power and using some of the techniques of political democracy to open up political possibilities that otherwise don't exist. So it's just for starters, I'm really happy to be on this panel. As I said, I don't have any real claims as a Machiavellian. I do have pretty strong claims as a Madisonian. And I think I've reached the stage in my career where I can just kind of stipulate this as a matter of fact. If I go to conferences where Madison's on the agenda, I notice the colleagues who want to say something critical of Madison look at me askance, and it's either because they're worried what I'm going to say in response, perhaps, or they're worried they're going to hurt my feelings. Somehow I'll be, my ego will be compromised if somebody has something critical to say about Madison. I have spent the better part of the past few decades, and I'm still spending time thinking seriously about Madison as a political thinker. And things I've written, I've tried to compare Madison to Machiavelli. In my book, Original Meanings, I have a chapter where I introduce Madison under the title The Madisonian Moment, and I borrow from Pocock's phrase, I think, in its dual meanings, I think pretty effectively there. In the book I published 1.5 years ago called Revolutionaries, is a chapter of Madison which opens with Machiavelli's famous letter to, I guess it's Vittoria, right, where he talks about how he puts on his old robes the evening to read the classics. Madison, as some of you may know, went through a serious course of reading in the classics to try to think about problems of ancient and modern confederations. I think he came away from it much less confident than Machiavelli did about the lessons you could draw. I think Madison was much more alert to the limitations of classical sources than Machiavelli, to the Court of Money or so earlier would have been. But there was a kind of nice little comparison. Then finally, it does seem to me that one of the devices, I can't say it's a major device, but it's a recurring device in John's book, is to juxtapose Machiavelli against the tradition I mentioned a couple minutes ago, that there is some kind of continuum, I imagine starting with Ricciardini in the first instance, and really culminating in Madison as kind of, I think, the last decisive figure here. And of course, if you think about Madison in that connection, as I think I've done when I made my brief Machiavellian comparisons in writing about him, Madison fits, I think, a lot of the roles that Machiavelli would loved to play. Madison, finds himself in a position where he truly was acting in a kind of idealized Machiavellian situation. I mean, Madison was a Republican lawgiver. And he's responding to the kinds of problems that Potok and others have spoken about, and he's doing so in a way that's deeply engaged, both with his own experiences, as Machiavelli obviously was in all of his writings, but also with a deep reflection on all the things he'd read. And Madison, like Jefferson and John Adams, had read quite deeply in both classical and modern sources. So, one way to think about this is I think John could well have written a somewhat different book in which he could have paid more attention to the kind of I don't know if I should say the avowedly or blatantly anti-Machiavellian motifs that would get you from Guicciardini to Madison, to the turning away from any kind of democratic possibilities. And a different kind of intellectual history that could have been written here would have been to do more. He would have involved doing more to flesh out more substantively in more robust terms what those criticisms would have been. So what I'd like to do in the 8 to 10 minutes or so remaining to me is to try to summarize a few Madisonian points here that tie in, I think, with John's major arguments. The first set of points, I think, should be fairly obvious and straightforward. In lots of ways, Madison would be a great figure for John to use in the way he did, precisely as an anti-democratic but Republican theorist. And I think Madison's reservations about democracy come, I think, really in two forms. I think one is simply analytical. Madison wrote Federalist 37, who I think was deeply influenced by Locke on language, wanted to improve the quality of political reasoning by being as precise as one possibly could about the use of key political terms, recognizing that those terms are always subject to expropriation and manipulation, but that a major object of political analysis should be to try to be as accurate and specific in the use of political language as possible. So one thing that Madison does, he did have the advantage of reading John Donne, but I think we would like Donne's book, is to say, let's define democracy as precisely and narrowly as possible. And when he does that, he does this in a famous passage in Federalist 10, which I'll kind of read briefly. From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mysteries of faction, a common passion or interest, which in almost every case be felt by the majority of the whole, a communication and constant result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. Basically, I think what Madison does here is to kind of encapsulate in concise form. Madison could be quite accurate, quite concise when he chose to write in that vein. An analytical problem: how do we define democracy? And we will use it simply to characterize direct political action and rule by the mass of citizens without representation or other kinds of institutions intervening, and then B, to produce a set of arguments as to why democracies are likely to produce misjudgments. Now, if you look at Madison's writings in detail in the critical period of Madison, the lawgiver, meaning from about 1785 when he starts pulling his thoughts together, through the movement to get to Philadelphia in 87, to get the Constitution ratified in 1788, to get it amended in 1789, you'll find lots and lots of illustrating, lots and lots of observations, others almost as well known as the one I just quoted from Federalist 10, which I think would fit John's scheme perfectly well. The anti-democratic Madison, the Madison who just is extremely nervous about any form of direct rule by the people. This Madison appears in various forms. I mean, in some ways, I think the kind of the best example might be the Madison in Federalist 49 and 50, who discusses Jefferson's proposals for constitutional revisions involving direct elections of direct elections of kind of reviewing conventions and let's say councils of censors coming from the people. Where Madison's argument, I think if you read it carefully, the kind of quasi-crypto-proto-Straussian way, really comes down to say the people are actually going to be the most likely sources of all the disruptions that constitutional government will know. So the idea of actually appealing to them to mitigate those conflicts is foolishness. And there's just a kind of a deeper concern that, when people are involved in constitutional experiments, these take place under very precarious circumstances. We can't be very confident that the right conditions will exist for the people to deliberate wisely. We have a moment where we need to act now. We should act decisively. We shouldn't have great confidence in the future that we could take up a proposal like the one John introduces at the end of the book and be able to discuss it in, fairly objective or fair fashion.